So I know we have a couple of questions that have come in online, on Twitter and by email, but first if I can open it to the floor and take a couple of questions from there. If you just wait till I pass the mic. Anyone? Two over here. Sorry, could you pass the mic?
Thanks to the Islamic Human Rights Commission for hosting this really interesting, wonderful talk by Professor Ramon. Thank you very much for coming and delivering that. A lot of points that I find very agreeable and interesting and informative. I just wanted to raise some questions, really, because you said that a concept of basically whiteness emerged post 1492. And you did make it clear when you mentioned that it's contested issue. So obviously you're probably well aware, more than I am anyway, of the type of questions and queries I'm going to put to you, because I'm not sure of the exact comparative chronology of the rise of the Anglo-Saxons dominating West Europe. And often people know that often Western imperialism is interchangeably called Anglo-Saxon Western imperialism as well. But how do you fit into your analysis the coming to domination of the Anglo-Saxons, for example, on the British Isles, whereby the indigenous Celtic peoples, there was a process of domination and appropriation to the extent where that's still an ongoing issue with the independence movement of Ireland and Scotland and Wales and Cornwall even. So I wanted to kind of ask, where does that fit in? And even going further back, arguably, than that, where then does the supremacy of lighter skinned invaders to darker lands, for example, my homeland of South Asia, I'm a historic invader or part of the historic invasions of the historic more darker skinned peoples by the Mongols, the Persians, etc. to South Asia. So I wanted to just really ask how that all fits in to your analysis. And another question is that, I mean, I agree with the broad analysis that you make, but what we've seen, especially with the rise of so-called humanitarian white supremacy or humanitarian wars and imperialism, that the choice for the white man, excuse the term, but I'm going to use it because this is the type of setting where I can use that type of terminology and feel relaxed and happy. How it seems that for the white man, the choice to deliver his domination by means of war across the world, particularly with the disaster, in my opinion, of the Arab Spring, has been through brown skin. That his choice is to use his proxies or mercenaries, or in the Malcolm X terminology, Uncle Toms, or as we would call them in brown skin society, that coconuts, etc. That is the choice perpetuation in terms of the public relations and propaganda of his domination. So I wanted to ask those, I think, two really broad questions to you.
Yeah, thank you for IHRC for bringing Professor Ramon to Wembley, which is local to me, so I'm really privileged to sort of have access to this, and it's really great to be hearing this discussion after a long time. I'm sure it happens everywhere, but in the public discourse, certainly in this country, we haven't really heard too much of this kind of analysis for a long time, so it's great to hear it. Your talk, I think I'm going to have to think about it for months to come, I think, but I have one question which I like some clarity from you on. I struggle with your defining Islamophobia as racism, because in a sense you've argued that racism before 1492, etc., wasn't in the way that we understand it today. So the discourses and... No racism before 1492. Oh, no racism, therefore no definition of racism, right? So therefore, the development, as you've described, would therefore maybe not be called racism. It developed, it became racism in some contexts, as you've explained. But what I would argue is that Islamophobia, in a sense, is a religious discrimination which has its own nature and its own form. And you've described in your explanation that a lot of what happened was to do with religious discrimination or religious exploitation, whatever you want to call it. And because I come from a background of anti-racism, and I've always argued against Islamophobia being part of racism, because in the discourse we have today, it limits what it actually is, and it prevents what you were saying towards the end of the Islamic discourses in our historical traditions and our voices being actually heard and understood in its own form, because you then have to define it through racism. You understand? We can only express ourselves through that framework. So therefore it limits us in a racial context, rather than our civilization is rooted in a religious context. Do you understand what I'm saying?
In this case, Western civilization?
Yeah.
Being Christian.
Yeah. Westernized, as you said.
Okay. In terms of the first question, I would say beware again of transhistorical arguments. What I mean by that is that it's very easy, because of our Western-centric common sense today, okay, to project into the past things that are very much from the present. And we look at the Mughals, and we call it the Mughal Empire, and we look at the Chinese, and we call it the Chinese Empire, and we look at the Ottoman, and they are the Ottoman Empire, and then we look at the Aztec, and they are the Aztec Empire, and everybody's an empire. Where is that coming from? From the idea of the Roman Empire. And we call Roman Empire everything that moved around the world, okay? And we flatten down all the diversity and heterogeneity of forms of political authority that existed before 1492 into this idea of everything is an empire. And not only we flatten them down, but we start seeing in those places the same thing are happening today, without even taking the time to understand in their own turn what the hell was going on there. The Chinese were a lineage. It was not an empire. The Ottomans were a sultanate. It was not an empire. Why don't we call the Roman sultanate, the British sultanate, the French sultanate? Why we don't do that? You see, we don't do that because we are in a Eurocentric world. And it's the other way around. We project the categories from here to the rest of the world and flatten down the world into this universal abstract, you see, and reproduce again, the same things that we see today, we see it in the past, and then we flatten down history. And after all, what do you conclude? Well, after all, just the West did what everybody was doing, and that's it, okay? And that's a lot of revisionist history coming out from Western-centric and from the Westernized university with this kind of narrative today, blaming everybody else about everything, okay? And basically, after all, Europe was not that bad, okay? This historical system that I refuse to call it capitalist world system or global capitalism, and for that it will require another lecture because I do work on decolonizing political economy, okay? We need another cartography of power different from this one, because that's again the Western-centric left telling us what the hell is this system about, and we're buying into that, okay? I refuse to use those terms because they identify two global structures of power. I have identified my word 15, 16, 17 hierarchies of power of the world system we live. And I refuse to call it capitalist world system. I prefer to use a long phrase at the risk of sounding ridiculous. This is a capitalist slash patriarchal, Christian-centric slash Western-centric, modern slash colonial world system. I prefer to sound ridiculous and use a phrase like that and put on the table what is at stake, than continue into this fairy tale that this is about capitalism, global capitalism. That's it. I don't want to diminish the importance of capitalism, but I don't want also to invisibilize everything else that is at stake by using this westernized left language that throws away everything else, okay, into some superstructure or some derivative of capital accumulation, and put it in a secondary term, because part of what happened with that trap is that you identify the problem in the wrong place. And that's what happened with 20th century socialism. They thought that by transforming the economic system, because that was the problem, you solve the rest, And not only they didn't solve the rest, they didn't even solve what they proposed to solve. Because if you organize in Eurocentric ways against capital, if you organize in racist ways against capital, if you organize in sexist ways against capital, if you organize in Cartesian ways against capital, if you organize in Christianocentric ways against capital, you reproduce the whole thing again. You're not going to go beyond. Because we're living not in an economic system, we're living in a civilization. That is reminded to us every single day by indigenous people in the world. They keep saying, I'm sorry, you leftist, Western left, this is not an economic system. This is a civilization that has an economic system as one of its important aspects, but it's not the only one. And they call this civilization a civilization of death, because it's the civilization that have killed more human beings in world history. And not only that, have killed more life beings beyond an anthropocentric term in world history, to the point that we don't know if 100 years from now we will all be alive as a species. Okay? So you could fool yourself and come up with universal abstracts, you see, and say, oh, you know, the Chinese were worse, the Muslims were worse, these people were worse, and do a history that is just a fictional history to liberate from responsibility the West and the present system we're living, and blame everybody else in the past about everything. You could fool yourself doing that. But how far can you go fooling yourself when you have in front of you basically at stake the system, the existence of human beings and the existence of life in planet Earth? Okay? We are in a system, in a civilization that is destroying life in a broad sense, not only human life. So I'm saying that because I'm going against the idea of universal abstracts, because it's a way of washing your hands and not looking at the fundamental implication of the system that emerged after 1492 that have colonized the whole world to the point that there's nothing left behind from that past, okay? And everything has been swallowed up into this one, okay? By the end of the 19th century, everybody have been colonized, okay? And everybody's inside. And we have structures of power, I cannot go in detail now, that are beyond the economics, that are destroying the world. And the economic is entangled with these other structures. Okay? You cannot disentangle the economy. There's no such a thing as the economy. Okay? Because what we call the economy is already entangled with many other things, many other hierarchies, epistemological hierarchies of power, patriarchal Christian-centric hierarchies of power. You have hierarchies of power, epistemological, pedagogical, racial, you name it, okay, that are constitutive of the political economy of the system we live, are not just derivative or superstructural. That's the fallacy of Marxism. They think that you're living in an economic system, the rest is just derivative, superstructure, etc. That's a fallacy. And in fact, it's the other way around. The so-called economy is already constituted from within by these other logics of domination and power, okay? So anyway, that's a long conversation, that's another, but that's the first thing I wanted to put on the table, that beware of calling the Mongol Empire and look what they're doing and things, because we need to take a step back and say, okay, what was the Mongol? Mongol was a sultanate, okay? And they have other forms of thinking about political authority, identities, and so on. You know, like for example, the Ottoman. The Ottoman, people say, oh, these were the Turkish, you know, were in power. No. In the Ottoman, this idea of nation state came later with Ataturk, what was his name, full name? Kemalism imposed this idea of nation state in a place where that didn't exist, because the elite of the Ottoman were multicultural. You see, it was not the Turkish. That notion didn't exist, okay? In the Ottoman, that came much later with the colonization of the West over that territory. But anyway, I'm just saying this because we need to take a step back, you know, before moving in that direction. Your second question was?
whiteness, white supremacy,
Okay.
domination through brown skin.
Okay, the second thing is that when I'm talking about the West and the rest, zone being non-being, I'm talking not only about a global scale, North and South, but I'm talking about zone being non-being inside nation state, inside local regions. That is, this is like embedded from the global to the local. What I mean by that is you have zone of being non-being in London and zone of being non-being in Brazil. Okay, so there are westernized elites in Brazil or in Senegal that occupy the position of the zone of being and of the West there. Okay, even though they might be brown skin or dark skin, it doesn't matter. And they exercise racism against the population in those countries based on color in the case of Brazil, because these are the white creole elites in power, or based on ethnicity, religion, or other markers in the case of Africa, because they have the same skin color. So it's not color racism what prevails. It's other form of racism there, you see? And I will include inside the zone of being those westernized elites that in the past, the Marxists would call it the comprador bourgeoisie, that are the intermediaries between the West and the rest in the third world. And they're fundamental for the functioning of the system, especially today in the so-called post-colonial world, quote unquote, because I don't think there is a post-coloniality today, okay? But what we have is structures of power, such as nation states all over the world, with, I call it westernized elites, because they are basically trained, educated in the westernized university, and when they come to power, they just do the same thing, you see, that the West was doing before. You see, when they were colonies, you see, now they are in the neo-colonial era, you have now local elites coming to run the nation state as intermediaries between local population and global imperial powers, you see. And how do they do the job? Because they become westernized. It doesn't matter if you're Hindi, Muslim, or whatever. You are basically colonized here, okay, and doing the job. And of course, not only is a mental thing, it's also a material thing, because they get a lot of resources and money in being in that position. So when I say zone of being, zone of non-being, don't get me wrong. There is a zone of being, non-being in London, in Paris, in New York, and there's zones of being, non-being in Rio de Janeiro. Look at how the system administrates conflicts in certain neighborhoods of London and in the favelas in Brazil. It's violence and appropriation. There's no regulation, emancipation there, okay? And look at the system, how they manage conflict in other zones, where you have regulation, emancipation, human rights discourse, and things like that. So here you have zone of being, non-being, from the global to the local, okay? And this structure, after the European colonial expansion, now you cannot say racism is a European problem. Racism is a global world problem today, because now that we've been all colonized and touched by this modern colonial world, you have the reproduction of these structures everywhere, okay? And so this is, but this is very easy now to slip into the idea that this that is present everywhere today, it was like this in the Mughals, in the Chinese, and then, you know, start extrapolating to the past, because it's our common sense today. But that's not exactly the forms of social classification that was used in those other power structures, you see? And we need to look at things carefully, because westernized scholars have put forward a historiography that in many areas, you know, have fallen into this trap of, you know, calling everything into the past, you know, extrapolating everything that you see today into the past in a flattened down way, you know, flattening down everything, and then make us believe that, you know, racism is from Adam and Eve, slavery from Adam and Eve, imperialism from Adam and Eve, capitalism from Adam and Eve. I mean, everything it goes back to Adam and Eve, you see? And then we fall into a kind of caricature of world history and lose sight that the world was very diverse before 1492 in terms of economic, political authority, epistemologies, worldviews, spiritualities, you name it, okay? Very diverse. But this European colonial expansion basically flattened down many things in many parts of the world, okay? Your question in terms of Islamophobia, is Islamophobia a form of racism or not? For me, the system is a capitalist patriarchal, capital slash patriarchal, modern slash colonial, Christian-centric slash Western-centric world system. So for me, one of the hierarchies of power that is also racial is the superiority, the religious hierarchy of power. Among the 15 hierarchies that I mentioned to you that I do in my work, one of them is religious. And in that one, you have Christian religion, Christendom. I differentiate between the Christianity of power and the Christianity of grassroots and movements and theology of liberation and other things, okay, that have different connotations. But the Christianity that became the ideology of power in this system is Christendom, and is one of the hierarchies of power that I will name as one of the racial forms of classification of people. Because if you happen to be from other spiritualities in that hierarchy, is considered inferior, okay, to Christian spirituality. You see? And I would say that it doesn't take you away from the particularities of Islamophobia by acknowledging Islamophobia as a form of racism. Because Islamophobia, there are different forms of racism that are particular to each other, but have in common the classification of the population along the lines of the superiority, inferiority, along the line of the human. You see, that's what is common. Color, racism, Islamophobia, everything. But each of them has its own history and its own dynamics that we cannot collapse. Okay? For example, color racism, I mentioned here, has a very particular history. It began fundamentally with the decision of the Spanish Empire to put indigenous people in another form of coerced labor, the encomienda, and bring then Africans to do slave labor. And so that's when you have the coexistence there of this religious racism, of theological racism, of having soul or not, together with the other one that was based on color. But then the British, when the center of the world system that emerged in 1492 was displaced from the Iberian Peninsula into northwestern Europe, okay, and that happened with the Dutch in the mid-17th century. And remember, Descartes was thinking not from Paris, from Amsterdam. Okay, when I say this is the imperial being speaking, Descartes was producing his I think, therefore I exist from Amsterdam. When Amsterdam became the new center of the world system after the 30 Years' War, displacing Spain from the center of this world economy created after 1492. Now, when the new center emerged in northwestern Europe, they then subalternized the south of Europe and subalternized the Iberian Peninsula. And here comes Kant in the 17th century saying the transcendental subject, rationality, is north of the Pyrenees Mountains. Immanuel Kant, okay, I always say, you know, when you read Descartes and when you read Kant, you say, oh, the transcendental subject. Oh, he's talking about me. No, he's not talking about anybody probably in this room, you know. He's not talking about you, okay? Because he will see you as south of the Pyrenees Mountains. Now Spain and Portugal are contaminated for him with black things, Muslim things, and you have no rationality. Rationality is north of the Pyrenees. In the hands of whom? Women? No. The white man, and he used color now. He's going to say now, the white men have use of rationality, have achieved maturity, as opposed to whom? The yellow people, the black people, and the red people. Red people are indigenous people in the Americas, yellow people are in the Orient, and then black people in Africa. He will use these terms in his anthropological writings. So when he talks about the transcendental subject, don't get it wrong. He's not talking about you, okay? He's talking about the people above the Pyrenees Mountain, in particular the white man, okay? So I'm saying that because you could see how later on with Hegel, it becomes the spirit passed through, goes from the Orient to European civilization, and Orient stay in a childish stage, okay, the maturity of civilization is European, and the spirit that is civilization, human civilization, never passed through Africa or the Americas. That's Hegel, okay? Lessons of history of Hegel, okay? So these people are building a historiography that is, pretty much racist, okay? And the philosophy itself, is, I said, is a philosophy that is founded on epistemic racism / sexism, okay? Where, everybody else is out except the Western man, okay? North of the Pyrenees, okay? Don't get it wrong. Okay? Everybody below. Now you see with the financial crisis in Europe, we're back again with this north-south split inside Europe because for the last 20 years, Spaniards and Southern Europeans were living the illusion that now they were Europeans. Okay? Because, only until 30, 40 years ago, nobody dared to say they were Europeans in Northern Europe. Okay? From Kant all the way till today, nobody dared to say that. And then suddenly they were incorporated into European community, and they believe and really believe that they were now Europeans. Okay? That happened. To the point that Rajoy, the president of Spain, have gone to Merkel and said, we're not Uganda. You cannot treat us like Uganda. I said, what do you mean? You are Uganda for Merkel. Okay? And you're Uganda for the British white elites here. Okay? And for the French. You're Uganda. Who do you think you are? Okay? Now they're realizing, and when you read their discourses mobilizing Northern Europe of the crisis, these people are lazy, these people are corrupt, these people are this, and nothing about the big plundering of financial capital, okay, around the world, including Europe. Nothing about that. These people are corrupt, these people are lazy. The same thing they say about Uganda. Now they are hearing these things. Well, this is very old in Europe. It goes back several centuries. It's just that there was a moment of 20 years that created this illusion in South Europe where they thought that now they were Europeans. Now, to say that, to talk about Islamophobia as a form of racism doesn't take you away from the particularities of Islamophobia and from the history. You need to go to each colonial history and look at the particularities in how this group were classified and racialized as opposed to this other and as opposed to that other. Okay? Part of what they do with these particularities is put one to fight against the other, and we shouldn't do that. Okay? We should understand that the history of African slave is different from the history of colonization of Muslim lands, and there are different histories, but with the same purposes and with the same racial logics, you see? And we shouldn't lose sight of that. At the same time, we account for our own particularities. So the fact that you take Islamophobia as a form of racism doesn't take you away from all the particularities that it entails in terms of this, capitalist, patriarchal, modern colonial, Christian-centric, Western-centric world system, because that Christian-centric part of it has to do with the question of Islamophobia that has been there as a constitutive. That's the whole debate in Europe about why Turkey cannot be part of Europe. They're Muslim. Europe is Christian, and suddenly you have atheists in, like the French Republicans that claim to be beyond any cosmopolitan religion, saying, we don't want Turkey here, they're Muslims, okay? Well, wait a minute, weren't you Republican, that you were supposedly beyond religion and things like that, Cartesian, in that sense? No, suddenly you could see how all of this, you scratch the surface, and there you have Christianocentrism there, okay? And what you have is really a circularization of Christian cosmology into all these secularist discourses, okay? That's why I said, from people without soul to people without DNA. This is a secularization of something that was Christian, coined in Christian theology. But the same thing you see in the French Republic. French Republic is the Gospel of St. Paul, secularized into this everybody's equal in the eyes of the state and the law and this kind of thing. But you read the Gospel of St. Paul, and it's the French Republic. So it's a secularization of Christian theology, but disguised from this egopolitan knowledge. You see that they're supposed beyond any kind of particularity, that they are neutral and objective and things like this. You see, these guys on the dark rhetoric is super Western-centric, Christian-centric, you see, racist, etc., ingrained and entangled in the whole structure. So that would be my answer to you. That I invite you to look at Islamophobia as a form of racism without losing sight of the particularities of your history.
We have a lot of questions actually from email, Twitter, and so on. I don't think we can get through all of them, so I'm going to give you two from here and then maybe one or two more from the floor before we wrap up. Actually, one question came even before your talk. It's somebody who'd done the reading that had been recommended. In your work, you talk about epistemic racism and Eurocentrism in the social sciences. What do you recommend students of this subject should do in order to counter this inherent bias? This is from Sophia Ahmed.
Well, I would say take seriously critical thinkers and even social scientists thinking from other epistemologies. Why is it that we don't have, as part of the canon of critical thought in the social sciences, Ali Shariati? We should read Ali Shariati. It should be part of the canon. Why is it that we don't have Aníbal Quijano? Okay, why is it that we don't have Sylvia Winter or Angela Davis? You know, why is it that we don't have Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, okay, an Aymara social scientist in Bolivia? Okay, why is it that, I mean, there are a lot of people out there that have produced critical thought, but thinking from the social historical experience of the zone of non-being. You see? But because they're thinking from there, from that location, they've been inferiorized in their knowledge by epistemic racism, sexism. So my call is not, many people hear me and they think, oh, this is an anti-European fundamentalist. You see? I'm calling for pluriverse of meaning. I'm calling for epistemic dialogue. And people are listening as if I was saying, no, don't read Europeans. That's not what I'm saying. I don't want to do to Europeans, to the white European, what they did to the rest of the world. Okay? I don't want to do that, because then we will be playing the hands of the same problems. They can enter the conversation. If they open the door and enter, as one more. And as long as they're not the center of the conversation anymore, because there's not going to be any more center of conversation. And they could enter the conversation as long as they respect horizontally everybody else in the room. They cannot enter the conversation telling us what is science, what is social science, what is philosophy, what is, oh, you're wrong, this is not, oh, you are an anti-European fundamentalist. I mean, get out of the room. That's not the conversation we want. Okay? That's over. Okay? We want a different conversation. That different conversation, they're welcome to enter the room. Okay? But it's only a one more, not at the center of the conversation. So they have to, in a sense, put their egos in place. Okay? Calm down, sit down, listen. You have to listen to the conversation, okay? Because nobody's insulting you, nobody's saying you cannot come to the conversation. I'm saying this really, honestly, because in many places where I talk, not here, of course, but in other places, you have these reactions. When in fact, this epistemic racism, sexism is a form of Eurocentric fundamentalism. You see, but we don't call it that way because it's the norm. It has become the norm, and we never call it that way. We call it philosophy, social theory, critical theory, scientific theory, but we don't call it Eurocentric fundamentalism. We never say Eurocentric fundamentalism has killed 1 million people in Iraq since 2003. We never say, it's not in the front page, nor in the last page of any newspaper, okay? Because they define who is a fundamentalist and who is not. And in their definition, they're out as a fundamentalist. Okay? For me, a fundamentalist is anybody who believes that their epistemology is superior to everybody else. Okay? And that's by that definition, Eurocentrism is a form of fundamentalism. And this foundation of the Westernized university, and I'm saying this with, you have, of course, exceptions in department where you have people in sociology, anthropology, in different departments trying to do something different. I'm not saying in absolutist sense. I'm talking as the dominant hegemonic form in which social science is built and produced today, and the humanities and so on, is based on this epistemology of the males of these 5 countries. Okay, you go to anthropology, you have to read Levi-Strauss, you have to read, Marcel Mauss, you have to read. I mean, these are the classics. You go to sociology, Marx, Weber, Durkheim. You go to the other. I mean, it's always males from these 5 countries. Okay. Now, that's a form of fundamentalism, and we don't call it fundamentalism because it's the norm. We're so ingrained into it that we don't take a step back and say, wow, this is really very fundamental, but we don't think about it this way. Fundamental is always the others, okay, that are, accused immediately. If you're thinking from other epistemologies, from Islam or from Aymara, you're a fundamentalist. Because they will say that a fundamentalist is anybody who reads a sacred text and turn it into a political discourse or something like that. That's the classical definition they use. Now, if you use that definition, because other epistemologies do not make a break, okay, between the spiritual and the political or the economic, they have a notion of Tawhid or Pachamama, or there are notions of cosmos, not dualistic, then you're accused of being a fundamentalist because you're thinking from religion. I mean, that's another word that we need to also put in question here, okay? Because you're thinking from religion, not from science. This is the thing they will be telling you, okay? But the problem is that they're also thinking from religion, but they just hide it. Nobody's outside cosmologists. Nobody's thinking beyond cosmologists. Whoever claimed that is really lying to you or hiding something to you, okay? Because everybody's thinking within cosmologies. And we cannot escape that, okay? You could be, and the most atheist is the most Christian-centric. No, I'm not really an atheist. No, but wait a minute, look at your discourse. It's repeating a lot of the Christian tropes, and instead of recognizing this openly and say, yes, we're Christian in culture and the way we see the world, they won't say that. They will say, no, we are beyond religion, okay? And that's the claim. Okay, so this is where I'm trying to say that you have to move into a social science that is pluriversal, that have the canon of thought have to move beyond epistemic sexism and racism and bring into the conversation other critical thinkers from other cosmologies, other epistemologies. I'm not saying that if you're Muslim or you are black or you're indigenous, you're automatically, critical thinker or decolonial. That's not what I'm saying, okay? I'm not an epistemic populist, okay? I'm not an epistemic populist. I'm not saying that anybody from socially from an indigenous group is already, decolonial and critical thinker. No, because the success of the system is precisely to make the people from below to think epistemically like the people from above. So I'm talking about the critical thinkers that are thinking from those locations, from the zone of non-being, you see? And those are the ones that I'm emphasizing as people producing critical knowledge that should be incorporated into the project of a decolonial pluriversal social science. See, right now we have a colonial universal in the sense of one defining for the rest social science. That is imperial and colonial. To decolonize that, we need to open us the field to epistemic diversity, and we need to break from these disciplinary divisions that are really very Eurocentric and think not in terms of disciplines, but in terms of problems in the world. So today, we have a lot of what Lewis Gordon called disciplinary decadence, because people are thinking from the problems of discipline and losing sight of the problems of the world. And that's why academia has become irrelevant. Western academia, they talk among themselves about disciplinary problems. They have replaced the problem of the different disciplines from the problems of the world. So they stop thinking about the problems of the world because they're caught in discipline, you see? And when you're caught in discipline, you fragment the world and you lose sight of the overall picture, okay? And that's why I would call to think in transdisciplinary way, not in interdisciplinary way, in transdisciplinary way. So we need a social science that is transdisciplinary, that is thinking about problems in the world, not about discipline disciplinary problems.
I just got a note that we're short on time, so I'm going to ask one last question, which has come via Twitter. Before I do that, we've had quite a few requests for the papers that you've written that are available online, and also some of the references and websites that you referred to be circulated. We are going to put them all up on the report page very quickly. Some are already up on Facebook and via Twitter as we speak, so please don't worry, they'll be there, as well as the video of this talk and the audio of yesterday's presentation and other resources. Final question is one from Roger Arto. Are there no already existing terms for this phenomenon of epistemic dehumanizing racism? And if so, what would be the disbenefit of using those terms, aside from obvious legal protection the term would afford?
There are people talking about epistemic apartheid, you know, especially you have some African American critical thinkers using the notion of epistemic apartheid, which is another way of talking about epistemic racism. Or, you see, I'm not married with any term, you know. What I want to capture is the phenomenon, okay, of a hierarchy of domination in which you have this hierarchy in which the Western man knowledge becomes superior over the rest, you know, and that's the problem. You could call it epistemic apartheid, epistemic racism, epistemic colonialism, epistemic Islamophobia, epistemic whatever, you know. You could call it in many ways. I have no problems with how we call it. The important thing is the phenomenon we're describing here, okay, and we are trying to capture, okay, and that we understand that the project is a political project for decolonization. That is what we're calling for, is decolonizing power and knowledge, okay, and that's the political project, and understanding that you could be objective without being neutral. You could provide evidence to what you're saying, but taking side, because this idea that you could produce an objective knowledge that is in the sense of neutrality is part of this God I view idolatric universalism that I was criticizing from the Cartesian paradigm, you know, and that is still foundational to the social science, humanities, and the Westernized university. It's the foundational piece of it. So what I want to try to say in the end is that I will call for a project of political, epistemic, and knowledge decolonization that will advance other categories of knowledge that is going to be they're going to be pluriversal necessarily, because we're going to depart from the acknowledgement that nobody's God, that we have to break from this idolatric universalism, that we're human beings, you know, and that we have limitations in our knowledge, and that only God has the possibility of knowing beyond us, you know, and nobody here can claim to have the possibility of knowing God-like, you know, and therefore accepting that limitation implies opening ourselves to interepistemic dialogues, because like Boaventura de Santos will say, there are wasted experiences and knowledges in having produced a scientific projects in the Western university that invisibilize and inferiorize the majority of the population in the world. So if we want to move into a world where many worlds are possible, we need to have a pluriversal decolonial project, you know, and instead of having a university, we will have to have a pluriversity. So not uni/versity, but a pluri/versity, because that means that now we have inside the university the inclusion of the knowledge of the people of the different epistemologies, critical knowledge of the different epistemologies and geopolitical locations in the world. And that will be really a decolonial cosmopolitan project. Not this false universalism and false cosmopolitanism that is sold to us as, which is really provincial and very narrow, okay, disguised under this cosmopolitan and universal rhetoric, okay? But anyway, that will be my political aim.
Professor Ramon, as I said at the beginning, I made a very poor introduction of who you are and the work